Hey, so are you ready to totally rethink everything you thought you knew about diabetes? Because today we're going deep, like way back, even before insulin was a thing.
Before insulin.
Yeah, like the 1700s.
Wow, okay.
This is going to be wild. And our guide is Gary Taubes and his book, Rethinking Diabetes, the new one that just came out.
Okay, I've heard of him.
So imagine, right, it's the 1700s, and this British doctor, John Rollo, he's got this radical idea. He's like, what if we just got rid of carbs for people with diabetes?
Really? Just cut them out entirely. That's pretty drastic.
Right. But he was seeing that when his patients cut carbs, their symptoms, they got better. And his solution is called the animal diet. You're basically eating only meat and fat.
Whoa, no carbs at all. That's a hard pass for me.
I know, right? Sounds crazy now, but back then it was groundbreaking. And it worked. Doctors were seeing real results with this high-fat, low-carb diet.
So, if it works so well, what happened? Why did things change?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And it leads us right to the 20th century and the discovery of, you guessed it,
Insulin.
bingo. Insulin was a game changer, no doubt. It revolutionized diabetes treatment.
Right.
But, and this is a big but, it also led to this total flip-flop in what doctors were recommending people eat.
How so?
Suddenly, it was all about high-carb diets.
Yeah.
The thinking was, well, we have insulin now, it can just cover all those extra carbs.
That makes sense on the surface, I guess.
Yeah, it seemed logical, right? But as we know, things aren't always so simple. And this insulin-centric approach, well, it had some unintended consequences.
What do you mean?
It's like this. Focusing just on managing blood sugar with insulin might have caused doctors to miss the bigger picture, how all those extra carbs were affecting the body in the long run.
That makes sense. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bigger problem without addressing the root cause.
Exactly. And Taubes argues that this shift to high-carb diets, it wasn't really based on solid science, it was more about the excitement around insulin, and maybe a misunderstanding of how insulin, carbs, and fat all work together.
That's interesting. So even back then, there were different opinions on the best way to manage diabetes.
Oh, absolutely. Not everyone jumped on the high-carb bandwagon. There are these dissenting voices, like this doctor, Richard Bernstein. He actually had type 1 diabetes himself.
Okay, so he was living with it firsthand.
Exactly. And he was advocating for something completely different, minimizing carbs to minimize the need for insulin. He wanted to work with the body, not against it.
And what happened? Did people listen?
Well, he faced a lot of pushback, especially from the mainstream medical community. But he stuck to his guns because he was seeing incredible results with his patients.
That's amazing. So this idea of low carb for diabetes, it's not new.
Nope, not at all. But for a long time, it was kind of like the road less traveled.
Interesting. So we've got this back and forth. Fat is good, fat is bad, insulin changes everything. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And just when you thought it couldn't get more complicated, enter the 1920s and this idea that fat, not carbs, is the real villain when it comes to obesity and diabetes.
Oh yeah, I remember learning about that. Like fat was public enemy number one.
Right. And this idea, it really took hold and had a huge impact on the dietary advice that people were getting.
So was it true? Was fat really the culprit?
Well, that's the thing. Even back then, not all the evidence pointed in that direction.
Yeah.
But the narrative stuck, and it's taken decades to really start to unravel it.
Wow. So what was the real story? If fat wasn't the bad guy, then what was?
Well, as we move into the mid-20th century, new research emerges that points the finger at a rather unexpected suspect.
Sugar.
Sugar. You mean like the stuff we put in our coffee?
The one and only. Studies, especially the work of this British scientist John Yudkin in the 60s and 70s, started to suggest that sugar might actually be a primary driver of diabetes.
Really? Sugar, not fat. That's fascinating.
It is, but here's where things get a little messy. The sugar industry wasn't exactly thrilled about this research, to say the least.
Oh, I bet they weren't.
They went to great lengths to try to discredit it, to protect their own interests. That's kind of unsettling. Makes you wonder how much influence industries have on the information that gets out there.
It definitely makes you think. And it highlights how crucial it is to be discerning, to think critically about where information comes from and who benefits from it.
Absolutely. So we've got this whole debate raging about fat and sugar. It's kind of a nutritional tug of war. Was there anything else going on at the time?
Actually, yes. In the midst of all this, another contender was quietly emerging, playing a crucial role that often gets overlooked. Fiber.
Fiber, like the stuff that's supposed to be good for digestion.
Exactly. Researchers like Dennis Burkitt and Hugh Trowell, they were noticing something really interesting. Populations eating traditional fiber-rich diets, They had incredibly low rates of chronic diseases, diabetes included.
So could the lack of fiber in modern diets be contributing to these health problems?
That's the question they were asking. And it starts to paint a bigger picture. It's not just about demonizing one nutrient or another. It's about understanding how all the pieces of our diet fit together.
That makes sense. It's all connected.
Exactly. And this is where we start to see a shift from a simplistic view of good food, bad food, to a more nuanced understanding of how different components in our diet impact our health.
So where do we go from here? We've gone from no carbs to high carbs, demonizing fat and then sugar, and now we're talking about fiber. What's the takeaway?
That's what's so fascinating. As we move into the 21st century, we've got decades of research, a deeper understanding of the human body, new technologies. But are we any closer to figuring out this whole diabetes puzzle? That's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. So we're in the 21st century now. And it's kind of ironic, right? We know more about diabetes than ever before, but it's still this huge health problem. It makes you wonder, are we really getting to the root of it or just like treating the symptoms?
It's a good question, and I think Taubes really hits on something important in the book when he talks about insulin therapy. It's been amazing, obviously, especially for people with type 1 diabetes.
Right.
But it's not a magic cure.
No, definitely not.
And as he points out, it can even be, well, kind of risky if it's not approached carefully.
What do you mean?
Well, think of it this way. Imagine your house is on fire, right? Insulin therapy, it's like dousing the flames with water. It's crucial in the moment. But what if you never actually fix the faulty wiring that started the fire in the first place?
I see what you're saying. You're just putting out fires without addressing the underlying problem.
Exactly. And one thing Taubes points out that's kind of unsettling is that the more insulin we use, the more likely we are to gain fat.
Really? So it's like we're managing blood sugar on one hand, but potentially creating other issues on the other.
That's the thing. It's all about balance. And Taubes argues that too much insulin can actually throw the whole system out of whack.
Which brings us back to what you were saying earlier about personalized nutrition.
Exactly. We can't just treat everyone with diabetes the same way and expect the same results. Everyone's different, their bodies respond differently, and what they eat plays a huge role.
It's like expecting everyone to fit into the same size shoe.
Precisely. What works for one person might not work for another. And this is where things get really interesting with Taubes' research. He delves into this growing body of evidence suggesting that carb restriction, particularly very low-carb or ketogenic diets, can be incredibly effective for managing diabetes.
It's about working with the body's natural systems, not against them.
Exactly. And remember Dr. Bernstein from earlier, he was onto something with that whole minimizing carbs to minimize the need for insulin idea.
Absolutely. It's not just some fringe theory anymore. Taubes presents a lot of evidence, both from personal stories and studies, suggesting this approach can lead to better blood sugar control, weight loss, maybe even needing less medication.
It's pretty remarkable stuff, but of course, like with any big dietary change, you've got to be careful, especially with a complex condition like diabetes. You can't just slash carbs and hope for the best.
Right. It's got to be done thoughtfully and with guidance from a healthcare professional who knows what they're doing.
Absolutely. It's about finding the right approach for each individual, considering their specific type of diabetes, their health history, all of it.
Right. So how do we bridge this gap? We've got all this new research, but how do we make sure people with diabetes are getting the most up-to-date, personalized advice?
Well, it's a big question, and I think it requires a major shift in mindset, both from doctors and from people in general. We can't be afraid to challenge old ways of thinking, even if they've been around for decades.
It's like that saying, don't be afraid to be the only one who...
Thinks differently.
Yes, exactly. We need more of that.
I totally agree. We need to be open to new research, new ideas, and recognize that maybe what we thought was true isn't the whole story. Especially when it comes to something as complex as diabetes, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's got to be personal.
So it's about empowering people to really be in charge of their own health.
Exactly. To ask questions, to advocate for themselves, and to work with their healthcare providers to find what works best for them.
Which is really what Taubes' book is all about. It's about encouraging people to think differently, to be open to new possibilities, and to take control of their health. You know, going through all this, it really makes you realize how much of the conversation around diabetes is about questioning what we've always believed, even when it feels like common sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how these changes in thinking, they often reflect what's going on in society as a whole. Take the whole fat is bad thing in the mid-20th century. It makes sense, everyone was worried about heart disease. but it also shows how fear can really shape how we view food.
Totally. It's like we were so focused on fat that we didn't even consider other possibilities, like sugar, which we talked about.
Yeah.
It just shows how important it is to look at everything with a critical eye and be open to the idea that what we think we know might not be the whole story.
Exactly. And that's what I appreciate about Taubes' book. It pushes us to think critically, to question assumptions. Science is always evolving. What we think is true today might change tomorrow.
It's like they say, the only constant is change, right? Especially when it comes to nutrition. But how do we balance that with giving practical advice to people who are dealing with diabetes right now?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And if Taubes is right, if diet is as crucial as he says it is, then we need a whole new approach to nutrition advice, one that's truly personalized.
What do you mean? How would that look different?
Well, imagine instead of just giving someone a pamphlet about cutting carbs or whatever, we take the time to figure out how your metabolism actually works, what their lifestyle is like, what they like to eat. We make them a real part of the process.
Right, because what works for one person might not work for another. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. We can't just throw medication at it and call it a day. We have to get to the root cause.
Absolutely. And like Taubes says, that usually comes down to our genes, our environment, and yeah, the food we eat. It's all connected.
So how do we actually make that happen? Because it sounds good in theory, but our healthcare system isn't exactly known for being, like, super personalized.
True. It's going to take a big shift, both in the medical community and just in how people think about healthcare in general. We've got to move away from this doctor knows best mentality and create more of a partnership between doctors and patients.
So it's not just about having information, it's about changing how we use it and how we communicate.
Exactly. Empowering people to be in control of their own health, to ask questions and advocate for themselves.
What I find so hopeful about Taubes' work is that he doesn't just point out problems, he offers solutions. He's giving people the knowledge and the tools to make real changes in their lives.
Right. It's empowering. He's reminding us that we have more control over our health than we often realize. And by working together, maybe we can actually turn the tide on this whole diabetes epidemic.
Well, on that note of cautious optimism, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the history of diabetes to the latest research, and even the challenges of personalized nutrition. But the biggest takeaway here is that you have the power to make informed decisions about your own health. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep exploring. This is just the beginning.